All right, here we go. Good afternoon, all. Welcome to Maximos Seminar Session 10 of Year 2. We are still in the Ambiguum Volume 1, and today we're looking at Ambigua 17 through 19. So Ambiguum 17, Ambiguum 18, Ambiguum 19. Pages 381 to 407 in Volume 1 of this book. Now, the themes in this reading, and continuing on, but are watchfulness, watching the horizon, so watchfulness, phrasing fire, phrasing divine fire, giving phrase to noetic reality, and what Balzac calls the intimacies of form, how form itself can draw us in, draw us near. So those are the themes: watching the horizon, phrasing fire, and the intimacies of form. And I just want to reflect for a moment on Maximos's phrasing and tonality and what that means. We remember that in this work, in all of his works, Maximos is not telling us his own ideas. He's communicating the thoughts of the tradition. He's not making this up. He's articulating. So this isn't his own work per se. It's a work of synergy already, a synergy between him and the divine, between him and the tradition, between him and his friend. He's writing of the tradition. He's communicating, conveying the thoughts of the tradition intimately and deeply to his friend. He's writing to his friend. He's writing intimately, bearing his soul, and deeply. He's allowing his mind to be to range. And so there is an intimate tonality to Maximos' voice, both when he talks to his friend and when he talks of the tradition. And he often calls his careful phrases, he calls them conjecture or conjecturing, which remember means to bring together. It's akin to symbol. Symbol means to throw together. Conjecture means the same thing, to put together, see what happens. So he's not saying, I know how to fit things together. He's saying, I'm drawing these things together. What happens? What kind of life comes out of that? Part of the reason why he can speak like this intimately about his tradition and to his friend, is that when you're speaking to a friend, if one knows one will be heard, one becomes free. If one is speaking to a friend, if one knows one will be heard, one becomes free. So Maximus is free here. We should think of him as free, not certain, not assured, free. He, like us, is thinking and praying as he's thinking. And last week, just after the session, my friend Ahmed sent me a note reflecting on watchfulness, which I really want to read out and begin musing upon in a moment. But because I was already thinking about Maximus, and then my friend sent me this note, I thought, so what is the experience of friendship? How may that develop? And so casting my mind back, Christ says, in your patience, possess ye your souls. Patience is the beginning of any relationship, patience and time. There needs to be time for the relationship, the friendship to develop over duration, to become stronger. And in that time, in that development, a willing co-responsiveness emerges, a willing co-responsiveness, a co-responding with that other person. This then begins to mean a shared energy, a synergy, as we say in the seminar. There's friend synergy. And we know that with synergy comes knowledge. So in this synergy of friendship, we can recognize, or there's the recognition of shared meaning and shared beauty, right, in the friendship. And as this becomes dependable, shared meaning and shared beauty, it becomes a co-responsiveness in beauty, And that forms the basis of the relationship. And on that ground, one begins to discipline one's time. One makes space in which thinking or communication may occur. One makes space for love to be felt profoundly. And then one begins to realize that there is a gladness and a peace and a joy in mutual presence with your friend, a deep attentiveness to their whole person. Now, we've broken down, let's say, an ethos or character in terms of line and rhythm and tonality before. So I want to think just of friendship in that way for a moment, in order to make a point about line and rhythm and tonality. Lines of thinking in a friendship are simple. They're the first thing. Agreement is easy. Immediate agreement, almost immediate, is fairly easy. From there, one becomes attentive to the rhythms of their soul. The forms and the confluence of inspiration, the inbreathing of breath, and elaboration, the setting forth of life. And then with attentiveness to rhythms of the soul, one becomes attuned to the tonality of voice. And tonality of voice is the most significant, the most revealing aspect of any meaningful thing. So this is present in friendship, lines of thinking that deepen into rhythms of being and is crowned by the tonality of voice. Right? So here we have a presence that is real and a felt fullness. Friendship is of an eschatological ontology. There's a fullness and a presence there. Now, the discipline and the gifts of friendship, everything I just said, all apply to tradition as well, but even more so. So the patience, the time to develop, the willing co-responsiveness, the energy, and then the synergy, the recognition of shared meaning and beauty, co-responsiveness in beauty, a love felt profoundly. These are the lessons of tradition as well. And so we could say that a friendship helps to form our temperament, our way of thinking about the world. Tradition helps to form our temperament, our way of thinking about the world. And this is what we mean by traditional thinking. This is what we mean by traditional thinking. Thinking that is deeply informed by that process of drawing near within friendship or within tradition. That's traditional thinking. We know that thinking always arises from participation. Many of us, I ask now around because it's sad that it seems that friendship is not as common as it should be. I wonder, do we know friendship and tradition now, or do we know ideas about friendship and tradition? If authority comes from within experience, then we need to have undergone tradition in order to think about it, in order to speak about it. Or to put it another way, in Maximos's way of relating existential terms. Knowledge for Maximos involves experience, and experience is inwardly formed by participation. And participation, which means partaking of life, means existence rather. Remember, Maximus says to participate is to exist. We exist insofar as we participate in life. So the intimacies of tradition and the intimacies of friendship are as one. When we talk about the tradition in theological terms, it's not as if there's a part of life which is understood theologically and the rest of life isn't. All of life is through this prism of love, of theology that we have here. Now, in the tradition, love is the central concept. We have three different Greek terms for love: philia, agape, and eros, right? Love is a word in English which we use fairly often and casually. But love is one of the, remember from last time, the image of the lumberjack, the tree, and how thinking is like lumberjack work, where you have to calculate the soil and the lay and the extraction and the rootedness and so on. Love is like that. Love is one of Maximus's trees. All right. We have to be very careful how we use or appropriate or what kind of energy we release from this. So let's think carefully for a moment about love. I think we can say a few things. I think we can say love transfigures our thinking and transforms our body. I think that's fair. Love transfigures our thinking and transforms our body or our being. And this insight or this idea is linked to the idea that Our thinking finds completion in our body, all right? Our thinking finds completion in our body. We think with our whole body and soul. We don't just think abstractly. Right? So love transfigures our thinking and transforms our body, and our thinking finds completion in our body. So we could say that love alters our whole stance, our whole being unto, our whole being unto. And the being unto of deepest love is co-generative. Co-generative. That's what philia, agape, eros mean at their heart. Co-generation. In other words, it's a form of synergy. Love as a form of synergy means the deep urge to partake of or to be a part of what is being generated, what is being created, what is being made within the soul of your friend or your close one. Right. With a friend, it's the renewal of soul. Remember, the soul is enfleshed. With a lover, it's renewal of soul and body. That's how love transforms on that level of intimacy. And with our God, the most intimate of all, it is the renewal of the whole person, the rhythm of the resurrection. So the friend is the rhythm of the breath of life within one. The lover is the rhythm of body and soul as one. And with the divine, it's the rhythm of the resurrection. All right. Just to come back to this idea of line, rhythm, and tonality for 1 minute. We're just going to set that down about love. Line, rhythm, and tonality. Line, rhythm, and tonality coalesce in the phrase. We've said that. Line, rhythm, and tonality coalesce in the phrase. The phrase is the unit of meaning. And our phrasing is always in response. It's always in response. Our life is co-response, co-response. It's not abstract. Abstraction deals with ideas. Phrasing doesn't. Phrasing deals with our being. Abstraction deals with ideas. And we pause for a minute and think it's actually quite easy mischief to study, to memorize, and to recite, say, words of scripture in passion. It's the simplest thing in the world. But Christianity is not about ideas or memorization or recitation. It's not even really what they call of the book, right? It's not a text-based religion. It's a religion of the living Logos, right? The person of Christ, in which is found all truth in which we participate. If one reduces Christ to lines and ideas, then one tends unto abstraction or wit, manipulation of words, abstraction or wit, and that passes for thinking. And this is why we take hyper care with our phrasing, because we know our phrases can get carried away, so to speak. Remember, Maximus says our life is a carrying and being carried along. We carry and we get carried along. Our phrases can be carried away, which is neither carried nor being carried along. Christ refuses to think in terms of ideas more than anything else. Right? He refused to think in terms of ideas more than anything else. He refuses to abstract or absent himself from the situation. He is, as Goa often reminds us, our model of presence. And so with Christ, we find there aren't glamorous concepts. There aren't arresting terms. Because it's not about definition. It's about the movement, the weaving of meaning between people, the drawing near into intimacy of those we love. So Christ has no glamorous concepts or arresting terms. What does he have? He has the emphatic and apophatic form. An emphatic and apophatic form, the parable. A parable is an emphatic form and an apophatic form. For the truth of a parable, it's apophatic because the truth arises from within the parable, moves with and through the story of the parable, but the truth of the parable ends beyond it. We need the parable to get to that truth. but the truth is greater, and that's how it's apophatic. And because a parable doesn't deny other ways of seeing things, it just draws this one forward. It's emphatic. And so in this way, we see that this kind of form, apophatic form, is always surmounting itself. It's always moving beyond. It takes us by the hand and leads us beyond. And that's how form is not blasphemous. That's how the material creation is not idolatrous, because it is from within, with, through, and beyond. All right. So Ahmed writes, I'm quoting, and he's referring to the English translation of the Greek title for the Philokalia. He says, that title, the love of the beautiful in the watchful, seasoned, experienced participants in the spiritual life, the Philokalia of the Neptic Fathers. That is luminous, filled with light, because it goes straight to the heart of it. The tradition is so much about this vigilance, this profound watchfulness that gives one pause to think, to anticipate, and to feel the promise of the fullness that comes with the mystery. This vigilance and the discipline that feeds it is of a life's work. And so let's just pause. So this title is luminous, filled with light, because it goes straight to the heart of it. The center of meaning is the pulse that gives rhythm to the whole body. Right? And then the tradition is so much about this vigilance to wait and to watch, to keep alert. This profound watchfulness that gives one pause to think. So vigilance and watchfulness precede our thinking. And we need to be watchful in order to think. We need to be watchful in order to anticipate and to feel the promise of the fullness. Feel the promise, not imagine or figure, but feel the promise of the fullness that comes with the mystery. Now, why do we attend to so closely to something like this? Well, because this is what Maximus teaches us. Maximus teaches us, and Maximus learns of Christ, remember. He teaches us what Goa keeps also teaching us, which is to be present to each other, to others, to the tradition. So, our caution is to be wary most of all of how we relate with ideas, how we relate with conceptions and perceptions, and how we may be free of their tyranny via apophatic movement. Okay, pardon me. Let's move to Ambiguum 17, please. This is on page 381. Maximus continues this thought. He says, it's not about ideas. It's about phrasing, and how we phrase, how we gather being matters ontologically, not just intellectually. Okay. So the actual, this is from St. Gregory's St. Great Theological Oration. The actual quotation from Gregory is not so significant for the focus here. So let's move straight to Maximus, because he's talking not about what they're actually saying, but what they're moving to do. And I'm just going to read the first 10 or 15 lines. Inasmuch as St. Gregory thought that the sole aim of the heretics was ignorantly to drag down together with themselves the nature beyond all being, and that, by means of pedantic logical arguments, they were endeavoring intellectually to delimit and dominate, so they thought, the indomitable power that without exception is incomprehensible to all creation. He elected, through the whole of this oration, to refer absolutely all privative and negative language to God, omitting no positive or cataphatic categories whatsoever, so that his opponents might not snap at them like shameless curs and rapidly sink their poisonous teeth into the word of truth. For they would have seized upon any positive statement about God as an opportunity to push forward their irrational propositions in the hopes of bringing their project to completion. Right. So just to begin to muse here. So phrasing moves or is moving. It has an effect in the world. He says their phrases will drag down, delimit, and dominate. we also see that there's a for the sake of for each phrase. Each phrase has its own fullness, its own end, its own results, its own pregnancy, you could say. And then around this, again, we have this translator using odd language, but to refer all absolutely privative and negative, so that's privative and apophatic, admitting no positive or cataphatic. Okay, privative here is what we call the alpha privative, like unnecessary, atemporal. It means the word steresis. It comes from the root for barren cow. It means sterile. All right. Negative, apophatic. We already know what that means. Apophatic translates from up and beyond. So it's that which is sterile gives nothing, or that which takes us up and beyond. All right. Oh yeah, and then just at the bottom there, for they would have seized upon any positive statement about God as an opportunity to push forward their irrational propositions in the hopes of bringing their project to completion. This is the idea of self-completion, the afto, the self-perfection that we heard a few times ago, was until the apophatic theologians, the highest form of truth to something. So this partakes of that spirit. If one thinks that one can complete one's own truth, if one forgets that only God completes one's own truth, then one has circumscribed oneself in a way which is of death. There's no life beyond moving into. Only God completes. In other words, we are always completing. Okay, and then just turn to 383 for a moment. I want to just, I'm not going to read, but just refer. On this page, Maximus talks about, is God contained? And he says, no, by no means, by no means. God is without grasp. God is sheer and upjutting. Contained also means definition. Is God given definition, or is God given horizon? Now, language doesn't contain, language calls unto, right? Just like phrases don't define, phrases call out for relation beyond our horizon. Our phrases call out for relation beyond our horizon and unto the life which flows through our horizon. Right? This is language as relation, not as definition, not as inward turned. And then over to 387, just quickly here. And I want to read, so the first full paragraph beginning if then no being, down to the bottom of the page, because here we have more about definition and identification, but Maximus puts it really well. Right. Beginning if then. If then no being whatsoever coincides in its essence with what is and is called the assemblages of characteristics that are recognized and predicated of it, okay, never coincides with its essence, assemblage of characteristics recognized and predicated of it, but to the contrary is something different from these characteristics to which they all refer and which holds them all together, but is in no way held together by them. For it is not derived from them, nor is it identical with them, or with anything from among them, nor is it derived from some of them, or from one of them, nor is it numbered among any of the things that are and are said to be around it. If, I say, this is so, then all those accustomed to idle impiety must cease to pounce impudently upon every word predicated of God, and, having learnt their limits in small matters, they should honor by silence the ineffable reality of the divine essence, which transcends all thoughts and knowledge. For as St. Gregory has previously stated, consistent with true doctrine, not even a small measure of the precise understanding of creation falls within the compass of our knowledge. A statement which affords me the opportunity to enlarge upon my theme and to marvel at the inscrutability of the wisdom which transcends all things. All right, just a couple of things here. Regarding definition, to define something means the identification of all being with what's in one's horizon, within one's horizon. All being lies within one's horizon. That's what the act of defining means. Beyond my horizon is non-being. Beyond this definition is non-being. That's why the language of being and non-being is actually the language of self and death, not communion. That's why we use being and beyond and more beyond being. All right. Second, neither predication nor derivation apply properly to God's relation with created being. Being is not derived from God, nor is it predicated of God. The relation of God with created being is that of being and beyond being. It's a free relationship. There's no ontological continuity or emanation. It's a free relationship. And then also regarding this line of silence, the ascesis or the discipline of silence is our healing time of synergy. When we learn to be silent, we learn to be healed in synergy because we find ourselves to be carried along. We are not phrasing our being in the same way in silence. We are being phrased by our Lord. We are carried along. All right. And then turn to 389, please. Turn to 389. Now, at the top, Maximus talks about grasping again in the first, actually in the first 2/3 of the page. I want to just refer to this section rather than read the whole thing out because some of his movements are important, but the whole passage isn't. So grasping, he says, it's audacious and arrogant to assume we could grasp by means of logic or by means of reason, etc., etc. Grasping here means to hold or to control, to have ready for manipulation. So phrasing doesn't mean grasping. Phrasing means to gather, to crest, to draw into the dance of being. It's a different touch. And then just in the basically the own center of the page, where Maximus talks about our own power of reason, and then expand into intellect, and then into thinking, and then into concepts, and then to understanding, and then to self-reflection, interior discourse. I just want to point out one thing here, which is how beautiful the movement of language and in language is. Because after reason, which is logos, intellect, thinking, concepts, understanding, and self-reflection all circle around the nous. So intellect is noisin, right? Concept is enian, understanding is dianian, self-reflection is sinian. It's all the activity of the nous within and around the integrity of the person. In English, this sounds like this, and then this, and then this. But it's a deepening of the dance of the nous, intimate dance. Okay. And this is a question just to hold in our minds because we return to it a little bit later. If there's movement in and of the nous, and I think that's true, it seems to be evidence here, movement in and of the nous. The question is, can movement be simple? Or can there be movement in simplicity? That's the question. Hold that in mind. We'll return to that. I think that that'll be an ongoing question. All right, and then the bottom of 389. Just the last three lines. Maximus has been asking a number of rhetorical questions, as in, do we dare arrogate this? Do we dare think that this is for us? And so he's asking our conscience, what is the mode by which? What is the bond? How do they act? What is their energy? What is the mode by which their orderly and unconfused movement is governed? Indeed, what in our own bodies is this complexion of opposites blended together in synthesis, which brings things separated by nature into an amicable community, subduing by virtue of the mean the severities of the extremes, leading each to inhere within the other without the loss of their integrity, but rather preserving the elements of their synthesis, which is the reciprocal presence of one extreme in the other by virtue of this blending. That's beautifully put. Let's read that again. What is the mode by which their orderly and unconfused movement is governed? Maximus is saying, our modes only go so far. Our modes only give us so much. If we try to complete our own thinking, we do not get very far with reality. Then, indeed, what in our own bodies is this complexion of opposites blended together in synthesis, which brings about things separated by nature into an amicable community, leading each to inhere within the other without loss of integrity. Co-inherence and integrity are words that we have, words for the movements within communion, or the movements of drawing near. Co-inherence. And I like how he insists that it's an inherence, a co-inherence without loss of any integrity. So wholeness is not lost in relation or communion. And then reciprocal presence, which is a lovely prosaic phrasing of communion, reciprocal presence. And after Maximus says, by what mode can we know these things? And then he says, in synergy, in synthesis, we know these things. So he is saying that we're also phrased, our being is phrased beyond our personal freedom. In synergy, we are also phrased by Christ. We don't just phrase our own meaning. We are phrased by Christ in synergy. And then so the section from 391 to 393, I just want to flag what he talks about that. Maximus is talking about creation after God, or in the Philokalia, the phrasing is sequent to God. Creation, all of creation is after God or sequent to God, as in not coterminous, or it has its own terminus. But also after God or sequent to God means that the currents of relation, the currents of our relation with God are given direction by God, not us. We don't choose our own way. We are drawn in. We are drawn in. And this is because everything that is made is circumscribed. Everything that is after God is circumscribed. Maximus says only God is free of circumscription. Circumscription means bounded within creation. That means composite, right? Circumscribed is gathered with intent to form a whole. So everything after God is circumscribed. We also know that movement, kinesis, is after God, sequent to God. So then this is the second deepening of the question. Can we know what is simple? The nous, we are told the nous knows our nous knows simplicity somehow. But if our whole sense of things is, first of all, aesthetic, second of all, circumscribed, and third of all, composite, What does simplicity mean for us? Okay, that's the question. We come back to that question once. Just a couple of more passages from here, and then we will move on to the last two. Page 393, in the middle of the page, nearly the exact middle, Maximus talks about Gregory's efforts to train our minds in piety. And later on, Maximus repeats the phrase, that God is, not what God is. We hold that God is, not what God is. I just want to comment on these two things. Piety is a form of knowledge, an effort to train our minds in piety, an effort for our piety to be our form of knowledge. I didn't know the word in Greek, but piety or pious in Latin, it comes from a Latin root meaning dutiful. So piety means duty, I guess, or dutifulness. But in the Greek text, it's a sevian. And if you look up that word, it maybe it's a slightly poetic rendering or felicitous rendering, because it has an equal sign and then another word that also means piety, which is evlavia. Now, evlavia means well held, good, EU, and then lav, like a label, held, right? But what it means is good holding close. So piety as lavia means good holding close, or a knowing touch, or maybe in good or beautiful relation, in good grasp, a hand holding, not grasping, but hand holding, good mutual, right? Now that sense of piety makes a lot of sense, and it reminds us that our knowledge, our spiritual life, is about relation. It's not about us feeling a certain urge to have to do something. It's about the quality of our relation. Okay, and then 395. We'll go to 395. And this is Maximus continuing his comment on that, not what. So this is near the about 6-7 lines down, about 5-6 lines down at the top of 395, right? Maximus says, in other words, there's a great difference between being persuaded that something exists and possessing a precise pardon. In other words, there's a great difference between being persuaded that something exists and possessing a precise comprehension of its essence. Do not then, he means to say, because in good faith I said that the divine essence is incomprehensible, treacherously twist my words to mean that I am saying that its very existence is beyond comprehension, and from this to conclude that I'm promoting outright atheism. So, in other words, there's a great difference between being persuaded that something exists and possessing a precise comprehension of its essence. Do not then, he says, do not then, because in good faith I said that the divine essence is incomprehensible, do not treacherously twist my words to mean that I am saying that its very existence is beyond comprehension, and from this to conclude that I am promoting outright atheism. All right. We don't need to be certain, but we do want to be drawn in. We do want to be drawn near and into participation. That we know, but we don't need to be certain. And we don't seek agreement. We seek convergence. We seek synergy, not agreement of line, synergy, right? Or confluence or integration, co-inherence, as Maximus said before. And we see here how little agreement in ideas means. A couple of sessions ago, you were telling us about the young men accused of atheism because they wouldn't bow to a statue. And this is another charge of atheism against Christians, or against this Christian, but not because of definition, but because of a refusal to define, a refusal to be certain, a refusal to say, I'll circumscribe God. And because of that, charge of atheism. All right. And then over to 397. This is the last bit here. The next two Ambigua won't take as long. 397. And this is where we come back to our idea of movement and simplicity. All right. Actually, Jennings, do you want to read this out? Just for the divine is completely without parts to the end of then it cannot be known. Just the last bit of this, please.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah, this this is one
I'll jump back in after you, but
I've got it all circled. Yeah, it's like it is just so beautiful. But here I go. For the divine is completely without parts, because it is completely without quantity, and it is completely without quantity because it is completely devoid of qualities, and it is completely devoid of qualities because it is completely simple. And it is completely simple because it is completely without extension or dimension. And it is completely without extension or dimension because it is completely infinite. And it is completely infinite because it is completely free of movement. For that which has nowhere to move to never moves. And it is completely free of movement because it is without beginning, for there is nothing greater that is anterior to it, nor is there anything alongside it that is equal with it, nor is there anything subsequent to it that could be parallel or contain it. And it is completely without beginning because it is completely unbegotten. And it is completely unbegotten because it is completely one and supremely singular above all others. And it is completely one and supremely singular above all others because it is absolutely undetermined. And this is why it is, in every respect, ineffable and unknown, and why it remains for all who move toward it rightly and with reverence, the ultimate limit of knowledge. For the ultimate truth that we can know about it is that it cannot be known.
Thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful. Many things.
Isn't it?
But let's begin a little bit. Just above that, I forgot we should have started 5 lines above it. Just above that, Maximus says, the divine is not subject to apprehension by sense perception. In other words, the divine is beyond our aesthetics. Remember, all we have is our formed life. All we have is aesthetic activity. That's all we are. And the divine is beyond formation, beyond figuration. Okay, that's the first one. The second thing, look at the progression. Without parts, okay, that's because of without quality. Without quality because of simple. Simple's fairly low on the thing actually there, right? Simple because without extension or dimension, infinite. Movement's higher than simplicity, or at least it seems to precede. So, that's very interesting, first of all. Then, movement is only preceded by unbegottenness, which is a mystery that we cannot comprehend. Just like our thinking ends with movement. We cannot think of anything beyond movement, just like we cannot think beyond time. That's what I meant by our modes are mortal unless through synergy given more light. That's the first thing. The second thing, look at what Maximus is, how he's speaking here. He's speaking positively and negatively. He's not speaking apophatically here. And look how hard it is to take this, just like this. We might say, what do you mean cannot be known? We can know, right? And so this is what the beginning of the Ambiguum is referring to when Maximus says, by confining the subject matter to being and non-being, his opponents seek to drag down into the lower recesses of et cetera, et cetera. The language of being and non-being is always of death. It can't get out of our immortal life. It's always aesthetic, is and is not. It's not apophatic language. Apophatic is and is beyond. And then the question, can the noose be simple? The noose moves. Is there movement in the noose? Can the noose be simple? And Maximus ends with reverence, which is really what we should land on 2 lines up. Reverence, that's the crown of his thought. The rest of it's a denouement. That we cannot know about, it cannot be known. That's secondary. Reverence is the highest point. Maximus is saying it's not really about knowing or thinking about knowing. That's the wrong. It's beyond. The love has transformed our body, right? Unto our being unto. Okay. Now, Ambigua 18 and 19. These are much shorter. And we'll read. I want to read all of Ambigua 19 in a moment. But first, I want to read a couple of passages, or have read a couple of passages from Ambigua 18. Then I'm going to ponder a little bit about 18, and then ponder a little bit about 19, and then we'll hear 19 read through, and then we'll talk the discussion. So Ambiguum 18 is on page 399, right? And it is all about the indispensability of the mode of aesthetic or aesthesis for our thinking and our making. We cannot comprehend anything outside of being and time, and being and time are our given form, and thus our aesthetic terms. Gregory, this is the extract from Gregory's same theological oration. If what does not exist is nowhere, then perhaps what is nowhere does not exist. But if it's, i.e. the divine, is somewhere, as it surely must be, since it exists, then either it is in the universe or beyond the universe. Gregory is dancing here with placement and location. He is using our terms to dance around God, right? Because place, location, relation, that's what we have. All right. Over to 401, please. So 4 lines, 2 lines from the 3 lines from the only other alternative consistent with the logic of their arguments will constrain them. Michael, do you mind reading from there to the bottom of the page? Just
I'm having such a hard time following this. I'll, if you don't mind, unless you have, I'll defer to someone else. Maybe someone else could read. So no,
that's fine. We're just focus. Reading. That's fine. That's fine.
Wait, we got to set the rules here. You mean like if I'm reading, I'm supposed to understand it? Yes. Come on, Michael.
You're a lawyer. You're used to moving around the courtroom and keeping abreast of all sorts of things going on.
Let's be fair to everyone involved. Not to worry, Michael. Don't explain yourself. It's
okay. I'll read it for sure. What is the page 401 beginning?
I'll read it. It's 3 lines from the top. The only other alternative, consistent with the logic of their arguments, speaking of Gregory's opponents, would constrain them to acknowledge that God does exist, but exists nowhere, and that therefore there is a God and that he exists, even though they do not know what he is or how he exists. For if the location of the deity is unknown to them, how much more unknown will the essence of the deity be to them? For this reasons, the exigencies of piety will require them to confess that what is not known by them exists nowhere. All right. What do we take from here? This is just a comment on the human mind. We are incarnate here and now and present, and we think in terms of placeness. And because we think in terms of place, we think in terms of location, our movement from this place, what Ian Angus calls locative thinking, our movement from this place. And so the structure of human meaning is deeply built on place and relation, or being and communion. In their form, these are both aesthetic questions, right? All of that we can comprehend. In none of that is God contained or defined. The one is simple, beyond grasp, beyond comprehension. To speak of place and location is absurd. How dare we? That's why Gregory's little perhaps is lovely, because he's stepping lightly here. Place and relation is ours. God is beyond place and relation. But in the economia of God, he relates with us. So he himself, if we can speak this way, is beyond relation, but he condescends to relation with us in his economy. And now just the 6 lines down in the last paragraph, just to follow to the end of the Ambigua. For we say that God exists, but not in a particular place, since its essential existence is not spatially circumscribed, and he exists absolutely, since he has no need whatsoever of any beings in order to exist, without which he has existed, exists, and will be able to exist eternally, or rather who exists eternally, because one who existed prior to beings cannot have beings as his place. Placement is an artifice. If among us, artisans are absolutely unable to circumscribe the existence and subsistence of being within their works of art, a being which is subject to creation, and which, to speak truly and correctly, has no existence, what could someone say about that ineffable and unknowable power that not only even the totality of beings, that not even the totality of beings could contain, and which is always the same and unchanging? Okay. Now, here's the point. Movement knows only the formed. We are in movement. We know only the formed. Something made means something given form. Everything made is given form. Everything made knows movements. Transformation, which is what our maker offers us via synergy, is from above. That's the transformation of love. But the apophatic stance, the Christian stance, our stance, is not a stance of certain conception. It's a being unto in love and relation, a being unto. And so it's one's stance, it's one's holy stance that is the ultimate struggle. What my friend calls watchfulness earlier. To orient one's own stance in synergy with the divine, to orient ourselves towards the divine in synergy, not to be certain, not to try to ascribe our categories to the divine, just to face the divine, watchful, vigilant, attentive, alert. And that alertness, that facing, that stance, if one can even speak like this, I believe is the whole theme of Ambiguum 19, because here Gregory relates something remarkable, and Maximos speaks about something equally remarkable that is really not to be casually addressed. But it's about visions and truth, visions and truth. Okay. I just want to, I'm going to tell you my half a dozen notes for this Ambiguum ahead of time, because then I want us just to listen to Maximus, because what he says will be better. But this is what I've been able to find. Holy stance. The holy stance of Gregory, which assures his authority here, is the Christian telos. Right? It's the intimacy of communion. One finds oneself drawn close. And in that drawing close, one finds oneself mutually present in a way which is transformative. Gregory Maximus ponders the idea of visions. So we can ask, in what phrasing does one communicate these kinds of visions? Not one, I mean, we don't. This is extraordinarily rare. With what tonality of voice? Our tradition is extraordinarily wary of assuming its way through silence. We're fine with silence. Watchfulness, silent watch, vigil is at the heart of it, as we've been saying the whole time. So in these visions, in this holy state, when we see things, Maximus talks about an image that one might see. This is not an image that we arrive at by conjecture. This is the divine bringing about a state of lively responsiveness as we respond to an image, but without external stimulation, right? Beyond normal cause. And he also says that our imagination, which he says is an intermediary faculty here. Maximus recasts the idea of intermediacy and intermediates. He makes it ontological rather than chronological. Right? Our thinking is an intermediary between extremes, what he calls extremes, or the poles, the boundaries. So a thinking draws together from the extremes and recasts in light of the whole. So a thinking itself tends unto completion. It tends unto completion. So thinking alone completes itself naturally in death. Thinking in synergy completes itself naturally in life. Okay. Okay, and then just two final notes regarding the gifts of synergy. In synergy, one is given beyond oneself something that then one conveys to others beyond oneself. In synergy, one is given something from beyond oneself that then one can integrate and convey to others also beyond oneself. In our phrasing, what we bring to synergy, time and being are gathered. We gather time and being in our phrasing. We work in the aesthetic mode. But in Christ's phrasing of our person, our time and being are gathered. Our time and being are gathered. And so this is also what we meant by paraphrasing before. If Christ is phrasing our beings, when we communicate that with another, as Maximus is doing here, Christ is phrasing Maximus's being. Maximus is paraphrasing our Lord. You see, it's not originality, it's not creativity, it's confluence and synergy of phrasing, drawing alongside, drawing near, drawing close. Okay. And then near the very end, Maximus uses the phrase as if. Anytime we see the word as if, it means the aesthetic is involved. And Maximus ends on by evoking the idea of obedience. And that's where I want to end here now too. Obedience here is remarkable. I think what he shows us is stunning. If we follow this line of thinking that he's been leading us along, right? Phrasing and being phrased in synergy. Obedience just means the confluence of our phrasing and our being phrased in synergy. It means that our phrasing has drawn close to Christ's phrasing. We don't see another, our will doesn't enter into it anymore. We don't think like that, like I want to do my own thing. So when our paraphrasing of Christ's phrasing of our being is in confluence, then when we have entered what Maximus called the light of obedience, the light of obedience, and it's a lightness of obedience. And in this way, obedience can take us beyond our own. That's the beauty of obedience. That's what obedience means in the tradition. It doesn't mean forgoing your own self in order to frustrate something. It's about synergy and the confluence of one's own phrasing of being and Christ's own phrasing about being. And in that confluence, in that synergy, we go beyond ourselves, beyond where we knew. Christ carries us beyond. It takes us beyond our own, where we didn't know how to proceed freely. Our freedom doesn't make sense beyond our own. And here, we've carried for a while and we are carried along. And that's the lightness of obedience. The lightness of obedience is a beautiful feeling of being carried along by Christ. Okay, now let's read the Ambiguum, please, because we need to get to the real fire. Goa, are you up for reading, or would you prefer to listen?
I'm easy.
You're easy. Okay, would you care to then, please? Just read the whole of Ambiguum 19. It's 3 pages long, and we'll follow along. Let's listen to this great saint walk us through these things, dance us through these things.
From St. Gregory's saying, theological oration. Whether this was an appearance during the day occurring in the imagination, or a truthful vision in the night, or an impression made on the governing power, i.e. the intellect, drawing near to further realities as though they were present. Our blessed Father, St. Gregory, being utterly purified by practical philosophy from all that habitually defiles human nature, and with his intellect thoroughly imbued with the qualities of the Holy Spirit, owing to his dedication to divine contemplation, through his true initiation into true knowledge, experienced the same things as the holy prophets. And with these words, he enumerates for us the different forms of prophecy. Now, if one must be so bold as to undertake an examination of these words, which were spoken with such brilliance and divine inspiration, and which are far beyond the grasp of anyone who is not himself like the teacher, it would seem best to do so conjuncturally and not categorically. Conjecturally and not categorically. Now, it seems to me, speaking conjuncturally, an account of my intellectual short-sightedness, that by an appearance during the day occurring in the imagination, he was referring to the vision and audition of things and words seen and heard by the saints that were not caused by the presence of some other person, but spiritually, not unlike a kind of perception. For it is not right to claim that in the case of divine realities, an actual image of them must necessarily be present in order to impress itself on the imagination. But rather that in such cases, the imagination, in a manner that is paradoxical and beyond nature, operates without the presence of another person, without audible sounds vibrating through the air, so that the one being initiated into divine realities truly hears and sees. For every mental image is either of things past or present, because there can be no object-based image formed of things that have not yet happened. For the imagination itself is a relation that mediates between two extremes. By extremes, I mean the capacity to imagine something and that which is imagined, from which, through the meditation of the imagination, which is a relation of two extremes, an image is produced, being the end product both of the activity of the imagining subject and the passivity of the imagined object, in which the two extremes have converged through the relational medium of the imagination. For whatever apprehends certain objects is said to accomplish this activity, whereas whatever is susceptible to the apprehension of something else is said to undergo this passively. Thus, whatever comprehends exercises a natural activity, whereas whatever is comprehended experiences a natural passivity. And both the passivity and activity have as a limit their conjunction in the mean term. For this reason, in my opinion, we must not regard an image projected by an object as suitable in the case of divine realities, for they are not the projection into the present of that which by virtue of its own existence is already concretely present. For if this were the case, it could not be accepted as something divine, since it possesses nothing beyond the order of nature. For if we ourselves, in our dreams at night, have the capacity to imagine various sights and sounds, frequently seeing and hearing someone speak who is not physically present, to a much greater degree, the saints in waking life are able to experience this, because what God, by means of a paradoxical gift of grace, accomplishes within them when they are conscious, we experience in our sleep, according to a law of nature. When he says a truthful vision in the night, I take him to mean neither the precise comprehension of future events by the soul during sleep, as in the case of Joseph and Daniel, or a certain vision of divine realities, which is visible to the bodily eyes of the saints by virtue of their extreme purity and dispassion. And when he speaks of an impression made on the governing power, I understand him to be stressing the forms of future events, which are manifested by the saints, which occur in a unique manner, as if they were seeing a picture according to a simple intellective intuition, which is without spatial or temporal extension. Though I myself have not received the gift of experience in these matters, I nevertheless was emboldened to speak of them conjecturally in response to the one who charged me to do so. If however, someone who has received this grace should read what I have written here, let him not censure my haste and perhaps impetuous judgments, but rather accept them in light of the obedience under which I wrote them, even if what I have said has no explanatory value for the subject at hand.
Amen. Let's begin to talk.
I must admit, I thought that Ambiguum 17 sort of had this Job chapter 40, chapter 41 quality to it of, oh yeah? And who are you to say who I am? And I just thought it was, I just thought it was fabulous. And then that paragraph that you got me to read, I thought just sort of built to a rhetorical crescendo that was fabulous.
Well, why don't we begin there, David? Why don't we circle back there and you walk us through what interested you, what tickled you about that? It's hard to begin with Ambiguum 19. It's so beyond. Which page? Tell us the page and walk us through that passage. Let's begin there.
Well, let's so I mean 17 is a few pages, but I would say that he's wanting us to he's explaining that Gregory is speaking this way to try to not let the ignorant drag us down about trying to get into defining God and, as you say, circumscribing God. I just found the part really, I guess, 389. For who, among even the wisest in this world, trusting solely in the powers of his reason and emboldened by groundless logical proofs, could grasp by means the logic, the magnitude of beings, reduce it to words, and set the whole of it before us? I mean, you almost hear, and could you catch a Leviathan with a fish hook? Just, in this, we can't even get the small stuff properly defined. So how is it that you expect that? And I think it's just a beautiful, what would the proper phrase be? It's sort of an epistemological humility that, you see someone brilliant exercising that, and it's just wonderful to see him using magnificent reason to say there are limits to reason. And I just thought it was just beautifully, not only beautifully thought through, but beautifully worded, and walks page after page right up to that reading in where is it, the 397. Just, the reason why there's no quantity, it's without quantity because it's devoid of quality, devoid of qualities because of it's simple because it's without extension or dimension, et cetera. Right up to, as you say, for we all who move toward it rightly and with reverence, the ultimate limit of knowledge. For the ultimate truth that we can know about it is that it cannot be known. I sort of heard ta-da at the end of that. It was just so beautifully, I thought, worked out.
What were your thoughts, David, about this, the culmination of that in reverence? I mean, is it fair to say that for what Maximus is pointing to here is that we cannot know, but we are called to regard? We're called into that moment of reverence, of attention. And that, of course, plays with this idea of obedience that Andrew talked about.
Well, I think it's a gift to us that we are given so much, especially in modernist times, if we don't understand it, then we try to break it down until we can understand it. And, this is, I think, that the type of analysis that's going on that Gregory is fighting against. This people who want to drag it all down. And given the, if you don't understand it, doesn't mean you can't revere it. You're not the full extent of what can be revered. There's something beyond you, and your natural impulse should be reverence, not breaking apart. I just think it just emphasizes humility, humility, humility all the way through it.
The other thing I like, Jennings, is that in that emphasis, what he's pointing to is the endless glory and beauty of the smallest portion, untouched of creation, which is glorious beyond measure, enough for us, enough. Yeah. There's no need to be greedy when one is feasting already.
I don't want to take away from that, but I did just one little thing is that one of the most beautiful images that, as I was really being introduced to Trinitarian thought, was, the concept of perichoresis, which has got this sense of this divine dance. And yet here I'm being reminded that it is completely free of movement. So, I mean, every analogy breaks down at some point, but perichoretic description of the Trinity is maybe not ubiquitous, but there's a strong use of that image of the Trinity. And yet, so you have this magnificent dance with Father, Son, and Spirit, and yet at the same time, no movement.
I would also like to consider that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Anna.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess Michael, you and I are in the same wavelength. That also troubled me, the lack of movement, but partly because of the Trinitarian and partly because if God does not move toward us, then, I mean, I would hesitate to think we could move toward him. I mean, we can, but it certainly would not be sufficient. So there's that sense of movement toward, I would think that God would move toward us to overcome the fact that we are not capable of really by ourselves moving toward him. That was a question I had, a thought.
Well, Anna, I know I have an inadequate response to that as a good old Protestant who's had to encounter the same sort of thing, but early on in these studies years ago, that was almost day one training was if something's moved, then there has to be something that's moving. Our whole life is to move to stasis, to rest. And so God is that because so he is without movement. And it's laid out here in part of why that is the case, because let me just find it here because that was so wonderfully. It was in a paragraph. It was in brackets. He is freely. Yeah, there it is. And it is completely infinite because it's completely free of movement.
What
For
page?
that, I'm sorry, we're on 397.
Right.
About halfway down, halfway through that second paragraph that starts for the divine. So it says, because it's completely free of movement, and then in parentheses writes for greater clarification, for that which has nowhere to move to never moves. And then you think, well, okay, what does that mean? And it is completely free of movement because it is without beginning, for there is nothing greater anterior to it, right? So there's nothing greater than God. So there's nothing before it, nor is there anything alongside it that is equal to it, nor is there anything subsequent to it that could parallel or contain it. And so the idea of movement, and perhaps Andrew, would be better to come from you or from David, but this idea of going, Origen had this idea of rest and movement, and Maximus reverses it. so that ultimately we will ultimately be at rest, that we'll be at stasis, and God is there, and always has been. Maybe, Andrew, you could fill in and politely correct.
No, that's just no, David. You accurately represent the way in which we've been comprehending movement here. Anna, your point about movement, it is true. The only distinction that one would make is that that's our perception. It's within our perception, divine movement. He's talking very, very cleanly here. So no, movement does not apply, but it's our sensation, and within synergy, it's our experience of movement. The participation is that. Yeah.
It's such a difficult thought to resist because the tradition goes back so far, subsequent to Heraclitus is, and perhaps even embedded in Heraclitus, there's this notion of both movement and simplicity, which paradoxically, perhaps in Heraclitus, I never know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Heraclitus because he's a highly metaphorical thinker. But his notion of the fire, which is a notion that you've emphasized in your preliminary remarks, is itself a kind of notion of movement and no movement, which can be reconciled perhaps in the notion of a kind of non-horizon or boundlessness. There's that Greek word that we noticed, a few sessions ago, Aristos, that captures this, and I don't think it obliterates the notion of movement, and perhaps this is where I'll sort of throw this out just to kind of just to bring out the kind of tension that there is between whenever we try to sort of settle into even denying a kind of denial. I mean, that's part of the sublime beauty of Maximus in that crescendo passage that David was reading and drawn to. And it seems to me that there is a kind of a worrisome rationalistic notion of trying to derive everything from the unmoved mover, and this is how Aristotle consolidates this tradition, and then it carries right through this whole tradition right up to Maimonides and beyond. And it's and it's hard to resist because the reasoning is quite impeccable and quite impressive. But it all begins with this premise of the prime mover is itself unmoved, and that's the part. If we were going to try to resist this impeccable logic, we might focus on. And if we think of the prime mover in more apophatic terms, there is a kind of a dangerous point. I mean, on the one hand, Maximus brings this up when he refers to, wants to emphasize that in emphasizing that we can't know anything, that we can't get a grip on anything, is subject to the the facile charge of a kind of atheism. And then he emphasizes that he makes a distinction to kind of stave off the kind of easy atheism, charge of atheism, that something exists, and being committed to that something exists doesn't entail that we can say what it is or how it is ultimately. But it's not an easy moment because we have to say something about what exists. And perhaps this is if we're in a kind of apophatic mode and we realize that what we say isn't a settled what, but something that is continually in movement beyond, in our understanding, then I don't think we have to settle with a notion of motionless. We can resist the kind of mechanical notion, the kind of causal beginning notion of motion, but we don't have to settle on a notion that obliterates it, because I think we're getting too caught up with words at that moment.
Michael,
just
I
pause
really
that.
like your point, and
Anna, wait 1 second. Wait
oh,
1 second.
sorry,
Pause
sorry.
that thought. I'm going to continue your thought, Michael, because you're right there, right? It is the distinction of saying God is or is not moving that is the problem, and that again is the language of is and is not, positive and negative. You're right. We cannot help but see things through what we know. And that's what apophasis says. Apophasis doesn't say we move and God is beyond, is not movement. Apophasis says everything we understand is from within and with movement and through movement, and yet it indicates what's beyond itself. Somehow God is beyond movement, but we only know him through movement. We only know him as movement, but that doesn't mean that it is movement. Knowing God as movement is an aesthetic term, an aesthetic move. And this is why apophasis redeems creation, because it allows us to recognize and bless what we know and say, this is how we know God. But we're not saying this is what God is. But this points that God is. The other thing, the unmoved mover, this is what the apophatic theologians, as Aziulis says, were resisting, the idea that God needs to participate in what he creates, he causes. It doesn't have to be an unmoved mover. God creates movement. That's it. We don't have to, it's the mystery, it's that reaching over into ontology that is the mystery of creation. It's
Aristotle's notion is quite sophisticated. I don't think it's a clunky notion, but it's still subject to a kind of apophatic response. And why think of movement in terms of space and time and matter? Why not think of movement in a kind of apophatic sense that we can't really begin to understand? Just like the notion of simplicity obviously doesn't obliterate all parts so that it's an absolute blah. That would be the kind of corresponding idea of atheism versus an apophatic mode. And simplicity, which is a kind of nothingness, would be a kind of nihilistic notion, whereas simplicity is a unity, which is just mesmerizingly complex, but not complex in a way that parcels out the complexity into things that we wretchedly try to analyze and separate and what have you. And so I think I would even if I was sort of falling back in the position that you're kind of generously offering, that this is just how we describe things, it's hard to know where to go, because many of the concepts we use are utterly mysterious. And so why not notions like life and movement, and these can be used in a way that in which our use has no pretense to understanding how we're using them. So I would agree with you, but I wouldn't characterize it as we're fumbling along in notions that are just clunky and human. I think rather we're being drawn up into something that is lifting our thought, not just
And I meant no disparagement at all. I honor what we do. I think what we do, what God's given us to do, is beautiful. Yeah.
Because everything is being carried. I mean, it's a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor. I mean, the very notion of apophasis isn't to negate, simply to negate. It's a movement beyond. So the notion of transfiguration, transformation, all of these notions are obviously contingent on a different sense of movement than the physical, spatial kind.
I have a question, but I think first, Anna, I was wondering if you were going to pitch into this, so I'd really like to hear that. And then my question arises from both what you initially said, Anna, as well as what Michael said. So.
Well, I was just wondering the way Maximus phrases it is that he says, God is free of movement because he is without beginning. And I'm wondering if the use of the term movement is not, whether it has resonances that are, I was wondering about the Greek, it's a simple question, the Greek word and its history, because to say he is free of movement because he is without beginning would imply a sort of more of an evolution than a simple case of motion. Do you see what I mean? And that's where maybe I'm getting back to Michael's idea, and I'm unaware of the complexities of the prime mover idea, but whether he's trying to suggest that, he doesn't start somewhere and end up somewhere else, God, right? So in that sense, he is free of movement, but not necessarily in the sense of, I don't know, I was reading the Pseudo-Dionysus, and he talks about God as a continual overflowing, right? Which would suggest movement, but not the kind of movement that's from point A to point B, or starts God one place and ends him up in another place that's bigger than that, if that makes sense. So I guess it's a little bit incoherent, but I'm wondering about the word itself, if anyone has an insight into the word movement and how it's, whether it really is to be free of movement is to be static. Do you see what I'm saying?
This is what Jennings referred to at the beginning. It's what Maximus is referring to here with origin and unbegotten, without Genesis. It's kinesis, stasis, and Genesis. It's the tripartite ontological schema which he's been dealing with the whole time. So he's turning origin on his head. That's what Jennings was saying. So because in this tripartite ontological schema, Genesis, kinesis, stasis, we come to rest in God. God creates Genesis. We are created. We are in movement. It's in that sense that the word is used. And the word, it's been a theme word throughout many of our seminars and throughout Maximus,
great.
but he uses kinesis each time, I think fairly consistently. So we've been kind of assuming it's that coherence when we see movement or motion. So I think that's fair to say.
Anna, can I query something you said very early on? You said that our movement to God might not be sufficient, that I think you worded it that it would have to be more that God is moving towards us. Now, in the context or in light of some of the terminology, the language that Andrew used in the first part of our session about confluence and synergy, I'm just wondering, what do you think our participation in that synergy or confluence, what would it entail?
Oh, wow.
May
Am I qualified? I don't know if I'm qualified. I was thinking of grace, the descent of grace. So in order for there to be synergy, the problem with an overly aesthetic, as Andrew says, an overly self-generated assent to God is that it's a lack of humility, right? So we think we can, through our own extreme effort, achieve illumination, but we cannot, because it is always going to be insufficient. So we must also then have grace come down, and the synergy, it's always going to be more top down than bottom up, I would think, right? So synergy, I mean, we have to assent to it. He's not going to show up if we don't want him to. So he demands he requires our assent for the grace to come, but the grace has to come. Does anyone,
Yeah.
I hope you guys are.
This-
The grace is that movement downwards. And I say downwards because it's kenotic, right? It's self-emptying. It's not required of him to do this. He does it in his love for us. So that kenotic movement, is Christ, really, right? So again, the word movement, like you could find a lot of different ways to use the word movement in which Christ comes down. grace flows from above. So all of that moves towards us. So I don't know if that answered your question at all, actually.
No, it definitely, it definitely addressed it. Your use of the word humility, because that brings me back to David Jennings. Jennings mentioned the word humility. That Gregory is beautiful. I agree with David Jennings. The way he dismantles the position of like, God has attributes, and by that attribute, and that points to the essential humility that we must have. But I still, and this is because when Jennings said that, and then when you said the thing at the beginning about our movement not being sufficient, I thought about what Andrew said about confluence and synergy, and in as far as there is a participation and we are part of that, what is our responsibility? What are we doing? Because top down, I agree. Again, I couldn't agree with you more. And the significance of grace in that process. But where are we in that participation? What is our activity in that participation? Is there, or are we passively awaiting grace? And what do we do? And this might be a little bit vague, but this is as far as I can articulate it at the moment. What does, I'll just put it out there.
Does anyone else want? I don't want to dominate this. I have thoughts. I'll give it. This is a different point, but might help. I was thinking about the word that God is sovereign, right? And through the centuries, this was seen as God being a ruler over us, like a kind of compared to kings and princes and all the rest of it. I thought about the idea that God isn't sovereign unless we accept. God does not wish to be sovereign over us unless we accept him as sovereign. So when we say God is sovereign, that is what we are saying that makes him sovereign. Does that make sense? In other words, and I think maybe that's a way to answer your question, that unless we praise, right, let every breath praise the Lord. Unless we praise, we will not receive. So maybe that's our job, work.
I think that at least Maximus would say we're to pursue virtue. We're to restrict and then ultimately get tired of the passions. I think that's so that we can be better vessels to receive the grace. But so there's, there is in the New Testament, there's an extremely strict what we ought to do that we find ourselves incapable of doing, which is what makes grace all the more gracious. And it puts us in that position of humility, of knowing that we haven't earned it. So I think that's, if you sort of say, what do we do? We don't want to be Pelagians where we can earn our salvation. That just doesn't happen. And there is a real role for us in our participation in the Godhead, but we don't confuse our participation with earning something. I think that's the difference there.
Participation, I think, might lead us down, what do I do as an act? Perhaps the better word is what should be our orientation. I don't mean participation in the sense of acting.
Right, yeah. Oh, well, I think our orientation, I think Maximus lays it out, we have read so beautifully of what it means to pursue the virtues and to get beyond our passions. That's a lot to do for you. I don't know about you, but I can tell you from this guy,
you're
it's
right.
going to keep me pretty busy.
But Maximus also stresses the naturalness. Nature is an ambiguous concept. We can think of nature as in a metaphysical sense. If this isn't you can think of nature as something that is deeply given to us. And so we're of course, there's a preliminary form of grace, if I could put it that way, in the fact that we've already been made free. That's just our nature. We've been made with reason and agency. And so we have the capacity to receive. And so it wouldn't make any sense to have a movement down to confer grace upon a stone. But I mean, that would be, I mean, Anna sort of mentioned that, you know, in passing in her first response.
Well, I might disagree with the grace on a stone. I do think that during our Holy Week, even the stones would cry out actually speaks to an understanding of Colossians, where through all things, you know, Christ is in all things, and I think in a profoundly way. But I think your point's also right, Michael, generally. So anyway, and I know David Goa had a question that I keep causing him to have to wait for, and I'm kind of anxious to hear it.
Well, the conversation has migrated a few different areas, a few different directions, but my question was, is there movement in presence? And for Maximus, at least it seems to me, and in the liturgy, of course, we say over and over again, who is everywhere present and filleth all things. So there can't be any movement in that philosophical sense where the fullness of reality is already there. The only movement there is in the part of human beings, in the sense that they may not be awake to that. They may not be open to the surprise of it. They may not say yes to it. And we just, of course, have come through Nativity, which is the time in the life of the church where we draw near to the scandalous yes, where the young woman in Palestine said yes to a scandal. She was present to a messenger. And so my sense is that in these particular texts we've looked at, Maximus is trying to push back against a whole set of preoccupations we have, but behind it is his, and he really, I think, brushes up against this again in Ambigua 19, with this whole notion of obedience. And Andrew talked about it as a confluence, a coming together. So if in fact there is no movement in God, if God is everywhere present and filleth all things, the human being is the one, not my cat. My cat is sanctified. My cat is who he is. But as a human being, I have the capacity to not be that, to not be in the presence. And so we think of that as a kind of movement. But it's a movement to something it's an opening to something that's given. It's all there. It's presence. And the problem is I am not present. I am present to matters of my own making, instead of present to what actually is unfolding and what is there. I am not in confluence with it. And where he talks about, or maybe you were paraphrasing, Andrew, the confluence of phrasing in synergy with Christ, which is, I think you said something about it being beyond the self. Well, when we speak about that with Christ, it's so easy for us to be abstract about what that means. But when we say with Christ, what we also mean, whatever else we might mean, is in an anointed moment, in a moment where the wounds are not in the saddle, in a moment where we're not flexible. So the anointed moment, the Christ moment, is the anointed moment, and that's a moment in which we are, I think, always surprised. Or as you were saying, Anna, you were talking about the grace that comes. Yeah, it's there. It arises. I mean, we have lots of different ways of speaking about this, but my question was only earlier in this to try to understand this preoccupation you had, Michael, with movement. And I was simply wondering, since Maximus has been so clear on how all creation is imbued with the logoi, the presence of, and the problem isn't it becoming something else. It's forgetfulness of what it is. And then that forgetfulness easy. And obedience, that movement into reverence, because the root of that word is oblate, reverence, arising in us.
So, David, you're saying that, first of all, I think that's beautiful. I mean, if you take Colossians, that Christ is in all things. The entire cosmos is infused with Christ. The Logoi is everywhere at all times in all places and beyond all of that. Then movement isn't so, if movement is to go from a place to another, that doesn't really capture what it means to turn one's attention to the reality of what exists.
You're, in a sense, you're moving out of something that doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly. Out of
present to what does exist.
Yeah, and that's not movement. That is us actually coming to rest.
It's coming to rest, but
yeah,
but rest isn't neutral,
right?
And it's, in a sense, the opposite of movement. Well, I think I would put it this way. The opposite of movement isn't rest or even peace. It's presence.
Right. So
it's
when
dynamic. It's dynamic. And
right.
It also is not something you do or somebody else does. It's, I mean, words are always difficult here, but it kind of arises between you. It's communion.
Right.
That's what we speak about as communion.
So when we see something that is physically moving, let's say either the incarnation or the ascension, that is not movement in the way that we speak of it with kenosis type of situation. It is communion, which is sort of anti-movement. It is the encounter of what exists. And so when Christ ascends to heaven and sits in session as the second person of the Trinity, we don't think of that as movement. We think of that as full communion. And so that isn't movement, even though, the disciples perceived someone leaving for the clouds, and that very person still is in human form within the Godhead, and yet it's not movement. It is because of its form of taking of communion, of being completely present to one another. Is that a fair summary, or am I mixing up ideas?
Well, I tend to think that in all of these theophanies, all of these places where we have in the scripture images of the encounter with God, they're all about being grasped by presence.
Right.
Whether it's Joseph behind the mountain, Moses on Sinai, or whether it's the account of the baptism of Jesus Christ in the Jordan. Behold, this is my beloved Son,
Yeah.
in whom I am well pleased. And God says that to every single human being. This isn't peculiar to Jesus of Nazareth. That's what the Revelation's about. This is about you and me and about all human beings. So we move in the sense that we hear our name being called. We are grasped by something. And there's a moment when you're being grasped by it that you might even say, aha. But often this happens, well, I don't know how it is for you, but my sense is that often the experience of communing presence is something that I don't know when it happens. I think of it afterwards and say, thank you. So let it be. Amen. And it certainly seems to me to be a gift. Although I know from Maximus and the Church Fathers, it's not a gift in the normal way, except that life itself is a gift. So it's a gift at the center of the gift of life. But it's the norm. It's reality. It's what is. And it's what I'm just not present to most of the time.
David, can I ask you to, sorry, I want you to continue that thought, but pardon.
No, I don't have any thought to continue.
No, but you do. You've walked right in. So what you're talking about is beautiful. You just use the term grasped by presence. These moments in theophany are when one could say one is grasped by presence, right? Earlier you said, just bear with me for a moment, follow me. Earlier you said that in the moment of presence, one is surprised often, right? Now, in your terminology, leading words, over the past while, idolatry and presence for a while. Now presence predominated, right? You began to talk about presumption recently, but increasingly you've brought up surprise. And it's very interesting to me how you see the word surprise within presence. Then you use the word grasped by presence. And when we talk about whatever it means to somehow be in relationship with God, whatever that means, right? Our words are so metaphorical after a certain point but this is what Apophasis teaches. That's okay. It's like all of language is metaphor, but that's the only way meaning is. It's through the metaphor that we are. That's fine. We know the metaphor doesn't exhaust, but it is. Surprise, to be overtaken suddenly by something, or just astonished. I'm not sure. So I want to ask you about that word, but I want to ask you about that word in relation to Ambiguum 19. And this is what I would like us to think about. Following David's line of thinking here, presence, grasped by presence, the movement that is our effort to come back into presence. In the moment of presence, there is surprise, right? And we're thinking holy surprise, not something off-putting or unsettling. And then think of Ambiguum 19, how Gregory talks about what he underwent, how Maximus tries to understand how Gregory talks about what he underwent, how Maximus is saying, this is something that this isn't, an image that is beyond experience for me. So it is conjectural. He's drawing things together for us. It's only when things are drawn together newly or differently that they can be surprising or surprised. So Michael, Anna, Jennings, Ahmed, but David, just if you want to respond first of all, how do you see this word surprise? Or well, just how does that term fit within what we've been talking about so far? And the rest of it, let's begin meditating on Ambiguum 19 with David.
It might be apropos of nothing, but I think it's important that we don't see surprise as a deficiency. Medieval scholastics used to debate whether or not Jesus had a sense of humor, because humor, Aristotle, it has this element of surprise, and it's being surprised is what creates humor. Could Jesus laugh? I think was sort of the structure of most of the scholastic debates on the subject. And we know he did. We hear it, joyful, this, that. So I don't think the surprise has to mean there was a deficiency and you're made aware of it. But it is intensely human for us to accept in our inadequacies when revelation occurs. And surprise can be surprised by joy, So I think that's an important, because sometimes when we talk about surprise, we start with, oh, well, then the person wasn't either educated enough or something that would have eliminated that surprise.
Well, I mean, I think it gets back to the whole question of the unequal nature of the relationship between
Exactly.
God and man. You're surprised because it is beyond your conception. And when revealed as beyond your conception, that is that. So I think I would hope we would always be surprised, in a way, right? Because if we expected it, then somehow I think it would be diminished.
Or even worse, you're not looking, or you're not receptive. You're not willing to be present. That's how you can avoid surprise.
Well, I think it gets to this whole, and I don't want to, Western concept of, what you get into it, what you put into it, you get out of it kind of thing, right? So you invest this much, you get that much out of it. And surprise is always, you invest this much and you get so much more than you ever expected. And so to me, again, it gets past that notion of working towards salvation, or you do 10 things and you get there. It's beyond, and therefore the moment is extraordinary and we're not capable of.
Well, the Holy Theotokos was surprised when the angel spoke to her. Like that's a pretty visceral surprise.
Yeah.
If you're a young Palestinian woman, unmarried in that world.
Yeah.
And no doubt Joseph was also really surprised. And my sense is, I mean, I don't, this isn't, to me, this is pretty, all I meant by it is that any time one has received grace, to go back to Anna's earlier comment, the gift of grace, anytime one experiences love, anytime one has realized that there's been communion, I mean, it's in one way the most normal thing in the world, and yet it's a delight. It's a delight.
Mhm.
And you know, the fact that we're delighted by surprise is kind of a shame. I know you aren't, Jennings. I mean, you live in a world from feast to feast and delight to delight. But many of us, it's not quite that ubiquitous. We're not in Bermuda.
Fair enough.
I would like to suggest something about, because we've been talking about surprise and the importance of surprise and being open to surprise. It seems to me, I think, especially in Ambigua 19, that there is Maximus does present the idea that there needs to be a balance between surprise and preparedness, because he does use the word initiation in this Ambiguum. He does talk about 4 lines or 5 lines down.
Read it out, Ahmed. Yeah, read it out.
Yeah, starts from our Blessed Father. So following the excerpt from the oration. Our Blessed Father, St. Gregory, being utterly purified by practical philosophy from all that habitually defiles human nature, and with his intellect thoroughly imbued with the qualities of the Holy Spirit, owing to his dedication of divine contemplations, through his true initiation into true knowledge, experience the same things as the holy prophets, and with these words he enumerates for us the different forms of prophecy. To me, the use of the word initiation here suggests that, to quote Hamlet, the readiness is all. One has to be in a state of preparedness as well. It's not simply, at least this is my reading, that it's not, there is a balance. The emphasis is not on surprise, but we are empowered also. I think this has been mentioned before, but I guess this is my way of pushing back a little bit against the movement from top to bottom, to quote Anna, the surprise, and maybe coming back to a comment I said earlier about one's participation, and maybe this also dovetails with the comment that Andrew's anonymous friend made about the watchfulness. What is the watchfulness? What does that entail? I mean, is there a discipline in that, or do we just receive? Is grace a passive? Is grace a passive thing? Do we wait for grace? Does it come to us surprise as a surprise? Where do we step forward? Where do we make our step forward, our gesture to God? Are we responsible? Are we, or is it simply, and this is something maybe, sorry, Jennings, I'll just say one more thing, which is, I think earlier, in one of our earlier sessions, we were talking about the law and following the injunctions of the law. And I had also I feel like there's something passive about subordinating oneself to to a legalistic kind of path, like we are going to follow the rules and the law, and that will be our pathway to grace. There's something more mysterious in that for me, and that's the watchfulness, but I'll stop here because I'm just wallowing in seas of ignorance here. So I'll
let me dance quickly with you over to David. I think that that he has responded to your concern already when he said, "Oh no, I didn't mean surprise." I made it into a concept. I said, "What did you mean by surprise, David? It's with this other concept." And he said, "Oh, it was part of a phrase that involves presence. It was part of the phrase. It wasn't the point of the phrase." And I didn't realize that until we just underwent this. I mean, my question was before I realized that. It's when we turn a word in a phrase into a concept in prominence that we become entangled by it. I think that may have just entangled us unnecessarily. What I was trying to get at was in my regard for David, I pay close attention to him, like I pay close attention to each of you. But it's always interesting to me the metaphors around which a thinker's thought circles, right? And the surprise, the being in the moment, given something, which is something we've talked about throughout this session. It seems to me that I'm sorry, David? Realizing, right? It seems to me that this is the character of what how Maximus is phrasing Gregory's visions, we might say. This is, first of all, this is odd within the tradition. People don't talk about visions, and other people don't talk about other people talking about their visions. It's not done. It's strange. It's extraordinary for this even to be here. That St. Gregory would say this is extraordinary. The Maximus would remind us of this and dwell on it is extraordinary. So there seemed to be the sense that we can talk about this. It's daring, but we can talk about it because it surprised us. It came upon us. That's the kind of sense I was trying to get at. Not well, but I was trying to get at, because it seems to me that there's no humility. Came up, Anna and Jennings earlier, right? Reverence, right? We were talking about movement and reverence. It seems to me that Ambiguum 19 is fully humble. I want to stay with this for a minute. I want to think about this for a bit. Fully humble. It doesn't seem to be overweening, and yet if we follow the sense and the truth of these phrases, they're talking about an image of truth given to the mind, impressed upon the person directly from the divine. This is intimacy at its greatest. How would one dare to assume that happened to you, first of all, let alone assume one could, hence the question, in what tonality of voice do we communicate these things? It's the question with which we began. Maximus is talking intimately with his friend about tradition. That intimacy of tone is necessary to convey these truths well, yet that intimacy of tone is very difficult to transpose out of close communication. This is the essence of idolatry in the spiritual life. It's in this mystery, how to shift tonality, that idolatry begins to rise. And what we're given here on Ambiguum 19 is, to me, completely remarkable. I'm stunned that it's included. So what do we make of it? And yet, it seems to be reverent in tone, humble. Pardon me, I started exclaiming. I moved. Ambiguum 19, let's think about this for a minute. Michael, what did you make of Ambiguum 19? What did you, I mean, in any sense?
That's too big
Andrew,
a question, so I'll let someone else jump in.
Just a question before we begin. When you say this breaks with tradition, or it's exceptional in tradition, what did you mean by that? Because there are others in the tradition who have these.
Well, I know.
visions.
I mean, it's not common, and the common sense
it's not
in
common.
the tradition. The
Okay.
common sense. I mean, as in Saint Sophrony says, writing about Silouan, Athonite monks do not talk about visions. There's a deep reticence to ever communicate the most intimate experiences of the divine.
But what
all.
about like Saint Simeon's poetry? And
I said it was extraordinary, not unique.
oh, okay. No,
there
I'm
are
just wondering
examples.
because I'm
No, certainly, but they're only of the highest, and this is one of. I mean, this is one of the highest examples.
yeah. And doesn't Maximus say he doesn't have it?
Yeah, he sure does.
He says, I know people who have it, but I'm talking about those people and not of myself. Is that,
Right.
sorry, I'm just
Yep.
clarifying.
Yeah, no, and that's the revelation
That's
of
all.
obedience.
Yeah.
That's what obedience can bring us. It's his obedience that brought us this.
And I know
That's
we
what
want to get to, I know
Anyways,
we want to get to
pardon me, my
19.
question still stands.
Yeah. Before that, though, I just like with Ahmed, you ask, you know, is it just passive? And is surprise this passive, or what are we doing? What are we initiated into? What is our responsibility? What is our role in this participation? I was thinking about that. If we are, as David, I think, said beautifully, how this is about us encountering communion of presence. And when that occurs, we are surprised. I like the image of Moses in front of the burning bush. I mean, there's a reason why the angel of the Lord came to Moses. Whatever it is that Moses was and what he had done and everything else, there was a level of initiation there. And it was only because of that initiation that he showed the surprise about the bush. I mean, you know, the old line by Emily Dickinson, right? The rest of us are just picking blackberries. It's only to those who are attuned to this, looking for this, that we will be surprised. The rest of us don't see it. So I think that there is certainly a very active quality and effort on our part so that we're present. We seek presence so that we can be surprised by it, just as we might be if we saw a burning bush.
And just to confirm your point, Ahmed, certainly within the tradition, the whole purpose of asceticism is watchfulness.
Yeah.
The problem is, and the reason it's phrased that way is that asceticism is the disciplines to let go and let be. And the problem is, as long as we are filled with our own sufferings, our own passions, as long as our imagination, and I mean, this text is so charming in this way, as long as our imagination and our memory is giving us prisons for how we see the world,
yeah,
we're not seeing the world. We're projecting onto the world things that are inside of us, and those need to be let go of. So watchfulness is absolutely central to that. And I certainly didn't mean, I don't know how you understood what I was saying about surprise. I didn't mean to suggest that there wasn't something going on here.
That's why I use the word balance. No, I agree with you 100%. The surprise is essential. I worry, based on my tradition, which I'm lapsed from somewhat, but there's a tendency to produce spiritual deaf mutes, where, as you say, one is not open, where belief and spirituality becomes idolatry because one is not open to the mystery, because and that is a thing. I feel like that's a great danger, and perhaps a greater danger for those who believe than those who don't believe.
It is much greater. That's why atheism's a better position.
Yeah, precisely. It's a greater responsibility and a danger. So this idea of an initiation or preparedness, that's always concerned me. That's always something that's preoccupied me, which is, how does one be watchful? Not just simply watchfulness, but how does one be watchful? How does one actually, what does one do beyond in a way that's not passive? But I mean, a lot of what has just been said answers that question, or addresses it at least.
And I got it wrong. I was reading, so it wasn't Dickinson. It was Browning. Yeah, earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries. That's watchfulness.
That's great. I wanted to say something about initiation, and I don't know what all was going on in Maximus here around that. But initiation is, I expect that what I'm about to say was part of what is implied in his use of this term. Initiation is always a death. It involves a death. So when we look at initiation rituals, whether it's the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert or Orthodox baptism, it is a death. So there is a dying to what you have presumed to be the case. And an arising to, in a sense, what is a new order.
This makes me think of something Andrew said that was so beautiful before about God is the resurrection of rhythm. The idea of a resurrection of rhythm. Andrew, just a quick question. Is that an ongoing, this idea of a resurrection of rhythm, is that something that is ongoing?
You're asking me about the most difficult thing I said. No, I was trying to get at how we comprehend degrees of love without putting up any stumbling blocks. And I considered co-generation as the common theme between philia, agape, and eros, right? I thought, what does co-generation mean then? Co-generation with a friend means like the rhythm of breath, the Holy Spirit in one, right? So it's a renewal of the rhythms of life. I thought, okay, with a lover, with a husband, wife. And so the friend is a soul. It's a deep loving of the soul, but it's in the flesh soul, the whole person, right? A wife, husband, lover. Okay, it's the body and the soul. So it's the renewal of the body and the soul within still the circumscribed life, right? But the deepest love is of the divine for us, and that's the most transformative of our whole person. And so it's a renewal. It's the rhythm of resurrection, right? And so it's the if you want to put it in terms of rhythm, it's the rhythm of life, of endless life, the endless rhythm of life, the endless heartbeat of life is what is renewed in us. That's the deepest. That's what Maximus calls the intimate, the erotic love of God for us. Right?
I really appreciate, Andrew, what you've said here. And this, I need to make confessions once in a while. I don't think there's any damn difference. The love of God, the love of the lovers, the love of friendship. It all seems to me to be participating in the same communion. And maybe that's heretical, but I trust that
it's simple.
I hope over the next year you will lead me to salvation. But it seems to me that they're the same, because they are about communion. And the forms of communion are not the point. The communion is the point.
You're speaking simply here, David. This is a simple way. That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
I think this is also a reason why I'm starting to love Maximus more and more, is that his language is super inclusive. It's so inclusive. I think someone mentioned last session about being, I think it was you, David Goa, about being careful with thinking in terms of, or thinking Christologically, just Christology. And in reading Maximus, I am stunned by I mean, I'm an outsider to your tradition, but it does not matter. It's so, I feel included. It's so inclusive, the language, and it's inclusive on the terms of that tradition. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's not about being Christian.
Yeah.
It's just about being human. That's the point. I mean, Christians commit that idolatry all the time. But then people in other religions do it too. There's a great ecumenism of stupidity. But I mean, the whole point is this is about being human. So I hope I mean, you are part of it, Amit. And I am so grateful you are.
One begins to understand, at least in my case, the import of Christ as a figure in your tradition. What is that? Like I told you before, from my tradition's view, Christ is such a mystery from the Islamic tradition that people tend to just think it's too fantastical, you know, and in this sense, they close themselves off to the import of that. And what I mean, this is a blessing for me, a gift, is that I'm starting to, I hope, beginning to understand the import of that in more than just a Christological sense, in a deeper, more profound sense. Yeah.
Well, you've been Christ at our table many times over the last year, Amit.
Oh, come on now.
Yeah.
Exactly the point. I mean, it's something I'm very grateful for.
Christ at our table is a good place to celebrate the feast. Let's pause here.